Okay, last time we were talking about I gave you a general overview of the theories of criminology, of criminality, and we talked about the classical and positivist school. If you'll recall, the positivist school, the theory that we ended with, was starting to use the scientific method in order to determine what causes criminality. And the positivists were really focusing on more like the biological theories of criminality. Their research and their work was leading in that direction. We're going to take up that thread and start to look at some of these other theories that came out of that school, but came a little bit after. So one theory of criminality that was very popular in the 1940s and the 1950s was this idea of body types. By the way, the original research that was done here was not done with adults, but was done with juvenile delinquents. And following on the positivist tradition, the way that this research was done, the researcher William Sheldon, and you'll see his name in a second, but he went into juvenile institutions and had pictures taken of juveniles and looking at what type was very common in juvenile detention facilities. In his theory and his way of looking at criminality is often called somatotyping or somatotype theory. According to Sheldon, there's a relationship between your body, the type of body that you have, and the personality that you have. It's sort of a biopsychological constitution. So your typology is based on your body, but your body type tells us a lot about you. And again, this is the theorist is William Sheldon. The work that William Sheldon did really caught on during the 1940s and was still very popular during the 1950s. In fact, courts in the 40s and 50s commonly used this body typing in order to determine whether a troubled child needed to be institutionalized. So they took William Sheldon's theory quite seriously, although when you see what his theory is about, uh, with your 21st century mind, you'll probably think, well, that's crazy. But in fact, it was a well respected theory. So let's take a look at Sheldon's body types. According to Sheldon, there are three body types. The first body type is what he called a mesomorph or mesomorphic body type. This is a person who has a predominance of muscles and bone, um, large trunk. You can see here this long trunk, heavy chest, you know, large hands, so forth. And according to Sheldon, this person was a very active person, very assertive, but also aggressive and unrestrained, so very impulsive. The second body type that Sheldon identified is the ectomorph. The ectomorph was lean. You can see here a very thin, fragile individual, delicate body, small bones, droopy shoulders, small face, sharp nose, and fine hair. According to Sheldon, this person was sensitive, distractible, suffered from insomnia, had lots of skin troubles and allergies. The last body type, was the ectomorph. The endomorph. The endomorph had a tendency to put on fat. This is a body, this person had a soft round body, short tapering limbs, small bones, velvety skin. And according to Sheldon, this person's personality was very relaxed, they were very comfortable, they loved luxury, and they were extroverts. Now those are the three body types. And I should mention that Sheldon's original work was done only with males, and so that's why you've got males here, although it was later applied to females. Also, I should point out also that although Sheldon used the scientific method to try to categorize his body types, you can see that he played pretty fast and loose as far as the personality characteristics that were associated with these body types. He may have scientifically cataloged types of bodies, but he made some pretty big inferences in terms of what the personality is. So what did we find with Sheldon's body types? Well, the research generally shows that criminals are more likely to have a mesomorphic or mesomorphic endomorphic body type. So there is a relationship between body type and the juveniles that you were typically seeing in these institutions. Other people came along and applied it to females and found pretty much the same thing. One thing you have to keep in mind is that the findings are significant. In other words, they typically find that in institutions, in criminal institutions, there are more mesomorphs than ectomorphs, for example, or mesomorph endomorph combinations. But the findings aren't really large in magnitude. Also, you have to be a little bit careful about attributing too much causation. Obviously, Sheldon wanted to say that these body types cause criminality, but the fact of the matter is that there are lots of variables that could intervene. For example, there could be it could be the fact that mesomorphs, people who are muscular, who have a very strong, are able to bully and push their way through life and use aggression more to get their way. So just because they have that body, they're allowed to use those kinds of means. Also, it's entirely possible that once people go into institutions, they, as you may know, a lot of institutions require even adolescents and adults to work out, to run, to, there's a lot of fitness. So in other words, an ectomorph might enter an institution and start looking more like a mesomorph by the time Sheldon came and measured him. But in any event, this particular theory was popular for a very long time. At about the same time that, well, actually even just a little bit earlier than the somatotyping was going on, another big push in this country had to do with biology and crime, and specifically how genetics applied to crime. And the movement that I'm going to be talking about is the eugenics movement. Eugenics means good in birth. And it's the name that we apply to societal attempts to purify the human race by either eliminating the unfit or promoting the fit. So eugenics then tries to make the human race better by getting rid of bad genes in the population. At the same time, at about 1907 until half a century later, actually, there was eugenic criminology was very popular. And the belief was that criminality was largely based on genetics, and that the root cause of criminality were passed from generation to generation in the form of bad genes. So if you think about it, if you think that criminals carry bad genes, the one thing you want to do is keep them from passing those bad genes on. If you can keep them from passing them on, eventually you can purify the human race. So within that eugenics movement, there were two pieces that were important. One is negative eugenics, and that's what I just mentioned, the idea that you can save the human stock by preventing reproduction of people who are unfit. But there's also positive eugenics. What you want to do is you want to encourage people with good genes to produce more offspring. So at the same time you want to prevent criminals from reproducing, you want to get the good people in society, I'm going to use air quotes on good people in society, to have more kids. And so you might have policies that promote having children, giving tax breaks for having more and more kids, things like that. So the eugenics movement in the United States began at about 1907 and went until 1939, although there are remnants of the eugenics movement long after 1939, but this was the heyday of the American eugenics movement. Basically, there was this push to get rid of criminality by sterilizing women who carried bad genes. So Indiana was the first state to legalize forced sterilization in 1907, but many other states followed suit. And in fact, a majority of the states passed mandatory sterilization laws. They were known by a variety of names. You can see the sexual psychopath laws, registration laws, etc. But the main point was to prevent women who carried bad genes from having children. Now, unfortunately, you can see where this kind of movement could lead us, and in fact it did. In fact, when Adolf Hitler came into power in Germany, and later on, he claimed that his idea of genocide against the Jews was inspired by the American eugenics movement. So you can see where this could go awry fairly quickly, and in fact it did in this country. So if you look at who was sterilized during these years, they were mainly immigrants. In fact, one of the names that was given to the types of people who were sterilized: pigs, Polish, Italian, Greek, and Slavic. Or CIA, Catholic Irish alcoholics were named for sterilization. And in fact, the Irish suffered the most during this eugenics movement. Uh, states kept very poor records, but it's estimated that approximately 750,000 Irish people were sterilized during this time, um, with the idea that the Irish people carried bad genes, they were criminals, they drank, and therefore they needed to be sterilized. And as you can see, although you're trying to prevent criminality, think about criminality mainly being, like more males than females. The way that you prevent people from sending their genes forward was actually to sterilize the women. So let me give you an example of a case. This is the case of Carrie Buck. Carrie Buck, she was in an institution. This is her here, and that's her mother. Carrie Buck was in an institution for the feeble-minded. Institutions for the feeble-minded in our country were just catch-all institutions for anybody that was thought to be mentally disabled. She was there at the institution despite the fact, so she's 18 years old, I should mention, she's at this institution, and she's there despite the fact, think of it, this is an institution for the mentally disabled. She's there despite the fact she's had 5 years of schooling, and she reached a 6th grade level of academic competence. So in other words, maybe more educated than many of the women were during that time. The person, the head of the institution, Dr. Pretty, recommended her for sterilization. And Pretty maintained that she was a genetic threat to society. And so, given that she was a genetic threat, they wanted to sterilize her. So what was her threat? What was the case here? The case was against her was that her mother had 3 illegitimate children. So her mom was said to have a mental age of 8 and said to have a record of immorality. In fact, the court documents say that she had 3 children without good knowledge of their parentage. I guess that was a fancy way of saying she didn't know who the dads were. Carrie herself was adopted, but she was returned to an institution. She was given up as a teenager for being incorrigible. That's what ended up her up in the institution for the feeble-minded. The real thing was, however, that Carrie landed in the institution pregnant, and that was her incorrigible behavior. Basically, what they were saying was that Carrie was going to she was engaging in the same immoral behavior that her mother did, showing a pattern from generation to generation of immorality. Interestingly enough, even though this case went to court, by the way, this case went to court, was challenged, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, this particular case. And as you might guess, before Carrie could or could not be sterilized, depending on what the court said, she had her baby, and it was a little daughter. The interesting thing about this particular case is that they alleged that Carrie was actually immoral in her behavior, but later on they found out that Carrie was actually given up from her adoptive parents because she was raped by a nephew of the family, and they wanted to shuffle her out of the way. So I guess you could say that this was not something that she was engaging in willingly. Anyway, so this particular case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Buck versus Bell in 1927, the Supreme Court finally ruled, and they ruled against Carrie Buck and ruled in favor of forced sterilization. This is a quote from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes is often considered an extremely smart jurist. You probably have heard of him before, but this is his quote on the Buck versus Bell case. He says, "We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. it would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices, often not felt to be such by those concerned, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. What 3 generations was Justice Holmes talking about? He was talking about Carrie's mother, he was talking about Carrie, and he was talking about Carrie's daughter, Vivian. So break this apart. What he's basically saying is that, your country sometimes asks you to give up your life. And it would be strange if people who are already a drain on our society would make some lesser sacrifices. And interestingly enough, he sort of mentions that, and these imbeciles, these people that are called to make the sacrifice, don't even think of it that much. So in other words, he's saying they don't care. And it's better for all the world to prevent these people from having children instead of waiting to execute their children. And basically the idea that you can require people to vaccinate their kids is broad enough to require people to give up the ability to have children. Interesting thing about this, so Carrie Buck was sterilized, and her daughter was also sterilized also. What do we know about Carrie is that, yes, she did receive a tubal ligation. Later on in her life, she was paroled from the institution, and she worked as a domestic worker to a family in Bland, Virginia. She was an avid reader until her death in 1983. Her daughter Vivian, who, as I said, was also sterilized, did really well in her 2 years of schooling. She was one of her years, she was on the honor roll. Unfortunately, she died at the age of 8 when she got sick, and she passed away. But certainly Vivian didn't look like she was going to show any signs of imbecility. And yet they were required to both undergo sterilization. So you can see here where our country has made some rather drastic decisions in order to prevent criminality based on some kind of iffy theories about what causes criminality. Well, let's fast forward a little bit, and we're going to go into the 60s. In the 60s, the genetics movement is all but gone. However, there were other kinds of theories that came about because of certain killers or mass murderers. And one thing that was very popular in the 60s, this thought of this XYY supermale. And what they found was there were certain criminals that had 2 Y chromosomes instead of 1. So they were XYY males, super males. They were taller than average. They suffered from acne. Acne is, by the way, most often caused by testosterone, and somebody with 2 Y chromosomes is going to have a lot of testosterone in their body and have a severe acne. Less than average intelligence. And what they found was this XYY supermale was overrepresented in mental institutions and prisons. And the poster child for the XYY supermale was Richard Speck. Richard Speck was a mass murderer who, in 1966, he systematically killed 8 student nurses from a Chicago hospital slash university. These were young women who were training to be nurses, living in a dorm. And one night he broke into the dorm and tied up 9 of the nursing students. And through the night, he had sex with and killed each one of those students. Only one of the students survived. He lined the girls up and tied them up and incapacitated them. And this one young woman managed to roll under the bed. And since he didn't really know how many people he had tied up, she was the only survivor of that particular incident. But Richard Speck then became the poster child for the XYY supermale. And for a while there, everybody thought, oh my gosh, maybe this is the answer. Maybe most criminals are supermales. Now, even though we found that they were overrepresented in prisons, it turns out that wasn't a really good theory of criminality, because most people in prisons were not XYY supermales. Uh, there were many violent offenders who were not XYY supermales. Also, some people pointed to the fact that these XYY males tended to have less than average intelligence. And so some people said, well, maybe they're not overrepresented in the criminal population, but they're a little dumber than the average person, and so they're more likely to get caught. And that's why you see them in prison more. In any event, this particular theory went by the wayside pretty quickly. So let's keep going a little bit further. Let's go into the 80s. You know, we still haven't given up the notion of the possibility that there might be a connection between criminality and genetic predispositions. And in the 80s, our scientific methods became more refined, and we were better able to test the possibility that genetics had something to do with it. So, for example, in the 1980s, there were several researchers who started looking at what we call twin studies. So if you look at twins, if you look at monozygotic twins, these are twins who share 100% of their genetics. So what you do is you look at what's called a concordance rate. So if one twin is a criminal, what is the likelihood that the other twin will be a criminal? So when you look at the concordance rates for criminality in monozygotic twins, you find that they have a concordance rate of about 55%. Now, if criminality was 100% caused by genes, we would see a concordance rate of 100%. And you see that's not true. However, that doesn't mean that there's not a genetic component. Because if you look at the concordance rates for dizygotic twins or fraternal twins, you see that it's much lower. And when you see this pattern in twins, where the concordance rates for monozygotic twins are significantly higher than the concordance rates for dizygotic twins, that suggests that there is a genetic component. So more recent data has shown even a stronger rate for dizygotic twins, but there's always a stronger concordance rate for monozygotic twins. Let's look at another way in which you look at criminality. As you know, even with twins, monozygotic and dizygotic twins, you could make the argument that they're born to the same family. And to some degree, they're being reared by the same parents. And so the environment may play a role. And it could be that monozygotic twins are treated more similarly by their parents than dizygotic twins. And that may explain the difference in concordance rates. So there's another way you can do this, where you can parse out the effects of environment and the effects of genetics. And it's what we call a cross-fostering study. And what you have here is basically this design. So suppose someone gives their child up for adoption. And by the way, many of these studies that I'm talking about were done in Denmark, because Denmark keeps copious health records and criminal records on their adoptions. So what you have here is you could have a child that was born to a criminal, so they have a biological criminal parent, or they're born to a non-biological criminal parent. But those parents give up that child fairly early on. And so this is the biology and this is the environment. Now, obviously, you do not usually hand children to foster parents who are criminal, but in fact, sometimes they turn out to be. So you have a group that was raised by criminals or a group that was raised by non-criminals. And basically what they're looking at is how many of the children have criminal convictions based on this 2x2 fostering study. So just to show you what the results are, this is, again, I told you it was in the 80s. Mednick was a person who did a lot of these studies. But let me just show you the data here. What you see here is if you look at this table, the biggest influence on or predictor as to whether or not you're going to have a criminal conviction is not what your foster parents are doing, right? Because that other way, it's rather what your biological parents were. So in other words, showing a link again between criminality and biology. So I've taken you through a lot of different ways of looking at biology. Nearly every study concludes that there's some kind of genetic predisposition to crime. And these studies have been replicated by outside research groups, not just Mednick, but others. We've also found similar results in multiple countries. We find a connection between genes and criminality. The problem is where we're at right now. We have this idea that there's something genetic that is being passed on, but we don't understand at this point what exactly is being inherited. What is it? Is it an impulsivity that people pass down that makes you more likely to be criminal? What exactly is going on? Just to give you an example of how crazy some of this can be, let me show you this little picture here. You're wondering, what the heck is this? Well, scientists have known for more than a century that the finger length ratios differ between men and women, okay? Looking at your pointer and your ring finger. And that for men, the ratio actually predicts how much testosterone you were exposed to in the womb. And this is why men have different lengths. So the shorter the index finger relative to the ring finger, okay, the shorter this finger is relative to this finger, the more prenatal testosterone someone was exposed to. You can look at your own fingers right now. And if this finger, and you see right here, this is an example, if it's a ratio of this to this, the more the difference between these two fingers, the more somebody was exposed to prenatal testosterone levels. And there's a new study that came out that was linking this quotient to aggressive adult behavior. So again, what is being inherited? Is it that some children get more testosterone exposure? This is females and males, resulting in this weird ratio, which predicts aggressive behavior, or is it something else? The fact of the matter is, we really don't know. We're talking about more than 100 years of looking at how genetics might contribute to criminality. And although we know that there is a connection, to this very day, we still don't know exactly what the connection is. Okay, so that's it for the biological theories. And you'll have 2 readings where you're looking at psychological theories and sociological theories next. Okay, thank you. Bye.